Okay, so we're moving on to the next chapter. The topmost floor in the city. The topmost floor in the city. J. Hope's entry on the 10th of May, year 22. My narcolepsy occurred anytime, anywhere. I collapsed without warning while working and blacked out suddenly on the street. Pretended that I wasn't so concerned about it in front of those who worried about me. I'd never told anyone that I couldn't bear to count to 10. I always ended up having dreams about Mom when I blacked out. The dreams were all alike. I was heading somewhere with Mom on a bus. I was excited and cheerful. I read the signs that passed by, watched her profile, and kept fidgeting. I was about 7 in my dreams. Then it suddenly crossed my mind Mom had left me. I was 20 when I realized that. Mom was still sitting in the seat in front of me on the bus. She looked exactly the same from behind. When I whispered Mom, she turned her head as if she had heard me. Her silhouette glimmered against the bright sunlight and her hair fluttered in the wind just like at the amusement park that day. The saddest part was that I knew that I would wake from this dream if she turned her head further and looked at me. That's creepy, dude, and that's sad at the same time. I tried to tell her not to turn around, but my voice failed. I kept trying to shout, Mom, don't turn around, don't turn around. But she always turned around and looked at me. Just when our eyes were about to meet, everything turned white and the pale fluorescent light of the ceiling of the hospital room appeared. But it was the same today. When I opened my eyes, the first thing that came into sight was a fluorescent light on the ceiling. I was changed into a patient gown. The doctor said I seemed to have had a concussion and needed a more thorough check. I was moved to a 6-person hospital room. I felt exhausted. I always felt exhausted when I regained consciousness. So that explains all the videos and him being in the hospital. Jimin. 11th of May, year 22. Same day? No, day later. Okay. I was transferred to the surgery ward about 2 weeks ago. At first it felt strange to see people coming and going so freely. Soon I found that it was just another part of the hospital. There were patients, nurses, and doctors. I was given drugs and injections. All in all, it was about the same as the psychiatric ward. The only difference was that the surgery ward had a longer hallway with a lounge halfway down. Of course, there was one more major difference. I was allowed to freely roam the ward. At night, I sneaked out of my room and wandered around. I jumped and danced in the lounge and ran down the first floor hallway at full speed. These were simple joys that weren't allowed in the psychiatric ward. One day, I discovered something strange about myself while I was running down the hall. At some point past the kitchenette and emergency staircase, my body just came to a grinding halt for no reason. I still had about 5 more steps to reach the end, but I stopped and was unable to take another step. At the end of the hallway was a door. The door opened to the outside world, outside the hospital. The door had no off-limits sign, and no one came running to stop me, but I just couldn't go any further. I soon found out why. That was the stretch of hallway just like a psychiatric ward. As if a line was drawn on the floor, I came to a stop. At exactly that point where the psychiatric ward hallway would have ended. They called me a good kid in the psychiatric ward. Sometimes had seizures, but mostly I was obedient. I smiled and went on lying without anyone being the wiser. And I knew my limit. The hallway of the psychiatric ward could be covered in 24 even strides. When I was first hospitalized, I was 8. I cried and demanded to go home with Mom. Holding onto the iron door at the end of the hallway, I frantically tried to open the door until the nurses came running and gave me an injection. For a while, the nurses tensed up whenever I stepped into the hall. Now, no one paid attention to me even if I ran down the hall and reached the door. I already knew that the door was locked anyways. I just kept running down to the door and coming back. I no longer begged them to open the door or wept. But the world is full of people more idiotic than me. They held and shook the door endlessly. They were suppressed by the staff, given injections, and tied to their beds. If they had behaved just a bit more acceptably, their lives could have been much more comfortable. Those idiots didn't know any better. I wasn't like this in the beginning. I was also dropped senseless by the sedatives forcefully injected by the nurses and got caught trying to escape from the hospital in the early days. I called Mom, crying violently, to go hoarse several times. "I'm not sick. I'm okay now. Please come and take me home." I stayed up all night for several days, but Mom didn't come. When I was taken to the hospital after they found me unconscious at the grass flower arboretum, my parents didn't ask any questions. They ignored the fact that I had blacked out there. It was the same when I developed seizures. They hospitalized me, discharged me after some time, and transferred me to another school. Family reputation was important to them. A son with mental illness was unacceptable, which is, pause from this story, which is unacceptable. Your kid has a mental illness, you should love them regardless of what's wrong. But I understand the culture and can grasp the concept, but I don't approve. I attended school in between hospital stays, but I knew I'd be sent back eventually. It felt refreshing to look up into the sky and enjoy the fragrance of each season. But I tried not to hold them in my memory. They'd soon be kept from me anyway. Friends too. History of mental illness was not helpful in making friends. There was one exception. I met a group who felt like true friends. It was almost 2 years ago. I tried not to remember them, but I couldn't help recalling those days. I had to part with them after I had a seizure at the bus stop after school. The last scene I remembered was the window of the grass flower arboretum shuttle bus opening. And that's when I blacked out. When I opened my eyes, I was at the hospital. Mom was over in the corner talking on her phone. My mind whirled for a while. I didn't know where I was or how I got there. I gazed around and discovered windows with metal bars. Then it all came back to me. The blue sky I saw on my way home, the silly games we played at the bus stop, the arboretum shuttle bus coming closer, and the glares through the bus windows. I shut my eyes, but it was too late. The front gate of the arboretum appeared before my eyes. It was a school picnic day in the first grade. I was running through heavy rain with my backpack over my head. A warehouse came into sight. The door was left open and I stepped inside. The sticky, musty smell, the sound of my heavy breathing, and the screechy metallic sound. I sat up in my bed and screamed, "No! I don't remember, I forgot." Mom came running. Calling out to someone, I shook my head violently. I swung my arms in every direction to get rid of that smell, touch, sound, and sight. But the memories came flooding in. The dam that had held them back the past 10 years collapsed, and every detail of that day surged through my mind, eyes, cells, and nails as if it was happening again. I had a seizure and was given an injection. The drug flowed through my blood vessels and I quickly dozed off. I closed my eyes and wished that this was all a dream and that, when I woke again, I wouldn't be able to recall anything. That wish was just a wish. Instead, a cycle of seizures, injections, and injection-induced sleep that felt like falling off a cliff continued. After I woke from that sleep, my whole body felt like it was covered with mud. Mud that looked like blood. No matter how hard I tried to wash it off, that warehouse smell lingered. I scrubbed until I bled, but it still felt dirty. When the doctor asked me about it, in a concerned tone, I trembled and apologized at first. I repeatedly said that I was sorry. It was all my fault. Please let me forget all about it. Then I tried to pretend nothing had happened. I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't remember anything. So I gazed at the doctor and smiled. I don't remember anything. Did the doctor actually believe me? I wasn't sure. But what was important was that I became a good kid. My life at the hospital was peaceful. It was an ideal place to idle my time away. I didn't long for anything and didn't feel constrained, scared, or lonely. That was until last night, where I met Hosuk again. I was transferred to the surgery ward because I fought with the idiot who kept trying to get to the door at the end of the hallway despite the nurse's constraint. Both of us were injured and were put into 2 different rooms on the 5th floor of a surgery ward. I was put in a 6-person room, my bed was in the middle, and patients on either side changed frequently. I woke up in the middle of the night. The patient next to me seemed to be having a nightmare and continued to groan. The groaning sound came from the bed on my left. I pulled a blanket over my head. I was sick and tired of nightmares. I didn't need to hear this. I tried to put up with it for a while, but his nightmare went on and on. Finally, I got up and stepped over his bed. I tapped his shoulder and tried to help. It's okay, it's just a dream. I found out this morning that patient was Hosuk. I drew the curtains for my breakfast, and Hosuk was sitting on the bed next to mine. He seemed glad to see me again. Was I glad too? Probably in one corner of my mind. He had hung out with me and taken care of me, a transfer who was a complete stranger at school. He also took the long way home with me after school. I still recall the days when we used to walk home with popsicles in our hands. But he was also the one who saw my seizure at the bus stop before I came here. He was the one who brought me to this hospital. He must have run into Mom. I didn't want to explain my situation to him. I got out of the room with my meal left untouched. Hosuk seemed to follow me, but I knew every corner of this hospital. He couldn't catch up with me. I roamed around the hospital all day long. From the stairs, I saw the others, even Jungkook, when they came to see Hosuk. They hadn't changed much. All that afternoon, I climbed up and down the stairs and hung around on the other floors. I leaned against the window at the end of the hallway and counted the passing cars. I grew upset. I had skipped all my meals, and there wasn't anywhere to sit and relax comfortably. It was annoying to hear the peals of laughter coming from my room. I got angrier because I couldn't figure out why I was so angry. I came back to my bed late at night. "Where have you been?" he asked me casually. Then he handed me a piece of bread. It must have been because I was starving. The bread was warm and delicious. I couldn't help confessing to him that I had long been confined in the psychiatric ward, that I was briefly transferred to the surgery ward but would be sent back soon, that I wouldn't be discharged in the near future, that as he witnessed, I was a person who had seizures on the street, that I was a patient who might be dangerous. I didn't want to add the last part, but I thought it'd stop him from criticizing me. He paused for a minute, and then he took away my bread. "Jimin, don't exaggerate. Don't you know that I have narcolepsy? I can black out anytime or anywhere. Am I dangerous, too?" He took a bite of my bread. I just froze, not knowing what to say, and then he said, "What? You want this back?" He bit into the bread again and returned it to me. Took it back right away. He asked me, "Are seizures infectious?" "Narcolepsy isn't. Don't worry." He hadn't changed a bit. End of the entry. J-Hope's entry on the 12th of May, year 22. Now I have to go back and look at the date, sorry. So this is a day later, next day. I opened the emergency exit and darted down the stairs. My heart was hammering in my chest. I definitely caught sight of my mom in the hallway. As soon as I looked back, the elevator door opened and a crowd of people poured out. Mom vanished from my view. I desperately jostled through the crowd and saw her going through the emergency exit in the distance. I followed her into the emergency staircase and ran down the stairs 2 at a time. I went down several flights without a break. "Mom!" Mom stopped. I took one more hurried step. She turned around, another step down the staircase. Mom's face gradually became visible. Then my foot slipped and my entire body lurched forward. I swung my arms to keep my balance, but it was too late. I shut my eyes tightly, scared I'd tumble down the stairs. At that moment, someone grabbed my arm from behind, and I narrowly avoided falling headlong down the stairs. When I turned my head, Jimin was standing there looking startled. I quickly looked ahead again, too hurried to thank him. I saw a woman. She looked perplexed. There was a little boy next to her. The woman kept blinking her big eyes. She wasn't Mom. She stepped back with the little boy hidden behind her back. I just stood on the staircase without a word, gazing at her face. I couldn't remember what I said then to get out of that situation. I must have mumbled that I was sorry or that I mistook her for someone else. Come to think of it, I didn't even ask Jimin why he was there. My head was a mess and I couldn't process any of the details. She wasn't Mom. Maybe I knew that before I began chasing her. It had been more than 10 years since the day I was left alone in the amusement park. She must have aged and looked different from what I remembered. Even if I met her again, it wouldn't be easy to recognize her. Her face was almost completely erased from my memory. I looked back. Jimin was tagging along without a word. He said he'd stayed at this hospital since high school, since I last saw him in the emergency room. And when I asked him if he wanted to get out, he just kept hanging back, looking confused. Maybe Jimin was also bound with the web of memories like me. I took a step towards him. Jimin, let's get out of here. 3 days later. 3 days passed after J-Hope was discharged from the hospital. I didn't want to say goodbye, so I followed him secretly. While I kept hiding and tagging behind, J-Hope walked down the long hallway towards the door. He nonchalantly passed the line near the emergency exit where I'd always come to a stop. I watched him from behind. Without realizing it, I stopped right there. I could take at least 5 more strides, but I just stood there. Hoseok slowly reached out and gently pushed the door open. The dazzling sunlight poured in through the open door along with the countryside air. It smelled a bit pungent, but felt refreshing at the same time. The landscape on the other side of the door washed over me. When Hoseok stepped outside, the door began to close. I could slide through if I ran now. I looked down at the ground. The limit line, which was visible to no one but me, was still there. I turned around, or I was about to turn around, when someone passed by, shoving my shoulder hard. I fell forward onto the floor. I raised my head. Still lying on the ground, I had crossed the line. The idiot was running past me, heading for the door. He was the one who had shoved me. He continued to jostle others on his way. He didn't pay attention to them. As he pushed the door as hard as he could, sunlight streamed in again. He ran outside. A nurse chased him, but he was faster. The door began to close again. I sprang to my feet, 1 step over my line. I took 1 more step forward. It was only 3 more strides to get to the door, but I turned around again, well aware of my limit. A stranger already occupied Hoseok's bed. I closed my eyes, but couldn't get to sleep. I couldn't help but dwell on what he'd said before he was discharged. Jimin, let's get out of here. He wore a complicated expression that I'd never seen before. He never looked or sounded that way before. I was just standing there looking hesitant, not knowing how to respond. There was one more reason I couldn't stop thinking about his words. There was an incident that occurred right before then. I was waiting for the elevator on the 2nd floor where I had physical therapy. I tripped while scuffling with the idiot, and my wrist was injured and didn't heal well. I was getting impatient at Hoseok's discharge that it was approaching, but the elevator was stuck on the 9th floor. I thought I heard someone calling my name just as I was thinking of taking the stairs. Someone was standing in front of the emergency exit at the end of the hallway. I couldn't quite make out who it was with the sunlight coming through the window, and when I took a step forward, the person suddenly ran through the emergency exit. The person's profile came into sight momentarily, but I still couldn't recognize who it was. Who could it be? I walked towards the emergency staircase, feeling strange. As I opened the emergency exit door and put my head in, someone passed by quickly. I instinctively pulled my head back. We almost collided. "Mom!" Hearing the desperate cry, I stuck my head back in. It was Hoseok. It was Hoseok frantically leaping down the stairs, and there was a woman standing at the foot of the staircase. What's all this? I stepped onto the landing. Hoseok lost his footing right at that moment. I darted forward and reached out my hand without thinking and caught him. Hoseok faltered as I abruptly slowed him down, and I barely managed to keep my balance. He didn't say anything until we had climbed back up the stairs and stepped onto the 5th floor hallway. He remained silent while we walked to the hospital. Then he suddenly stopped and looked at me. "Jimin, let's get out of here." I couldn't answer. He told me firmly, "I'll come back for you." I replied, "I'm going back to the psychiatric ward in a few days." 3 days passed. I was to go back to the psychiatric ward the next day. I tidied up my belongings and laid down. I tossed and turned for a while, but he soon dozed off. I awoke with a sense of something falling. The hospital was a strange place, and it was hard to sleep soundly. I could feel everything around me with my eyes closed. And even the smallest sounds kept me wide awake. The hospital room was pitch dark. A breeze blew in through the open window. Curtains flapped amidst the flow of already sultry air. The ceiling, the floor, darkness, and silence. They were all familiar. I was about to switch on the nightstand where someone's hand held me back. It was HYYH. I sat up in surprise, and he put his forefinger on his lips. "We all came together," he said. "They're waiting for me outside." He reached out his hand. I was still buried under so many fears. I was invisible to my parents. I'd be taken as no more than an escapee from a psychiatric ward in the outside world. It was safer to just stay in the hospital as an obedient patient. I wasn't sure I'd adjust well out there. I could think of a million reasons not to leave. HYYH didn't hesitate. He grabbed my hand, brought me to my feet, handed me a t-shirt. I was out of bed before I even knew it. The hallway was still and quiet. 2 nurses were stationed at the desk. They were all occupied with their own work and didn't even look our way. But HYYH and I walked as quietly as possible, tensed up. The elevator was waiting on the 5th floor. When the door slid open, Namjoon and Jin were standing inside. We got off on the 1st floor and stepped into the hallway when HYYH abruptly pushed me into a door on the left. It was a lounge. It was usually crowded with patients and caregivers during the day, but at night, it was quiet and dark, only the murky lights of the street lamps flowing in. A candle was lit, and Jungkook and Taehyung came out of the darkness. Yoongi's face was also visible behind them. On the table were snacks and cans of soda. A nurse came through the rear door just when I took a sip of soda. Before I finished saying hello to them, the nurse asked what we were doing here, and Yoongi said it was a birthday party. She stepped into the lounge. "Are you all our inpatients?" "I don't think so." I was the only one wearing a patient's gown. Without realizing it, I tightened my hand around the soda can. The aluminum can crumpled with an eerie sound. HYYH grabbed my shoulder. "It's okay." It was Namjoon. "When I give the signal, just start running." It must have been Jungkook. So I guess he doesn't know who's saying what now, because he's just like peaked. Jin, who was already by the front door, threw us a glance and went outside. HYYH looked around us and spit out in a low voice, "Run, Jimin." We all started running. I was caught up in all the excitement and ran with them. Taehyung lost his footing and almost fell, and the snacks and plastic soda bottles flew in the air. We darted nimbly through the tables and poured out into the 1st floor hallway. The loud voices and footsteps of the nurses continued to pursue us. The hallway stretched out before us just as it did yesterday. My heart pounded as I passed the kitchenette and came to the emergency stairs. Without realizing it, my pace slowed. My head was bombarded with questions. Would it really be okay? Am I sure? It might be even harder out there. I might not have anyone on my side. It'd be safer and more comfortable in here. It's not too late. I better stop here. I better admit my limits. I better be a good kid. My line was just a few steps away. I looked back. Now the janitors had joined in and were chasing the others. My hand holding the t-shirt trembling violently. They seemed to be right on my tail. Maybe I had no choice. "It's okay, Park Jimin. Run." The voice pushed me forward. I took one more step. I crossed the line. I had only taken one step closer to the door, but a dramatic change occurred. Something inside me rolled and pitched as if I'd just leaped from one steep cliff to another. As I threw down my patient gown and put on the shirt, I took another step forward towards the door. The next step was faster, and the next even faster. The walls on both sides flashed by quickly, and the door drew closer in big strides. Only 5 steps were left to get from the line to the door. For anyone else, it was just a short distance of 5 steps. But I hadn't dared come this far. This was the first time I'd made it past the line on my own. The door was within reach, Once I passed through this door, the environment would be completely different from the one that had surrounded me. I refuse to think about what will happen. I'll focus on taking one step at a time. I pushed the door in with all my might. Every cell of my body collided with the outside air. There was no oppressive sunlight or fierce wind like I had always imagined. It felt like crying. The sound of my heartbeat reverberated in all directions. So he just made an escape, like hardcore escape. And the boys helped him do it. Okay. The next day. This is Jimin's entry. The next day. The next day, Jimin's entry says, HYYH's house was up on the hillside. It was the rooftop room of a dilapidated multi-family building at the end of a dead end. The dead end was through a narrow, winding alleyway from the main street and up a long, steep climb. That was where he lived. When we entered the room, HYYH bragged that it was on the topmost floor of the city, with the rest of the world placed at his feet. And he was right. This rooftop room had a view of everything. When I looked straight down, I could see the train station and containers standing in a row along the railroad. Namjoon was living in one of those containers. Just a little way off was the school we had attended together. While looking at our school, my line of sight reached a point across the river. A large apartment complex was perched at the foot of the mountain. That was where my house was. No, it was where my parents' house was. I had escaped the hospital without any plan. The hospital must have contacted my parents, and they must be looking for me by now. I didn't have the courage to meet them face to face yet. I couldn't go home. I had nowhere to go and no money. HYYH told me to follow him and led me here. That was how I ended up at HYYH's house. I looked over at the apartment complex again. I have to return there someday. I have to meet my parents and tell them I'm not going back to the hospital. I inhaled deeply, and HYYH came close, stood next to me. J-Hope's entry, HYYH's entry, same day, 16th of May. I could be my most honest self at home. Sometimes I screamed at the top of my lungs and sang at the window. Sometimes I played music and danced like crazy. And sometimes I awoke at night weeping. When I did, I just lay there still, staring at the ceiling. But I never collapsed with narcolepsy at home. Jimin didn't go back home after he left the hospital. He came to my house and was now looking down at the city, leaning against the guardrail on the rooftop. He must be looking for our school, the 2-star burger joint, and the changing lights along the railroad like me. He must also be looking for his house. That was something in our human instincts. Everyone looks for their home when they climb somewhere high or spread out a large map. I thought of asking him why he didn't go home, but I gave up. His head must be a mess, and I didn't want to aggravate it. Besides, I could guess why based on how Jimin's mom reacted at the emergency room that day. In fact, I rarely asked my friends questions. I felt I knew the answers to most of them already, and I didn't want them to feel awkward, or they might find my questions too inquisitive and annoying. To be honest, I was always curious where the others were headed when they walked by my store, but I never ran out to ask them. Where was Jungkook going with his wounds? Was Yoongi's workroom in that direction? Why did Namjoon leave school? Where did Taehyung first learn graffiti? Come to think of it, I didn't know much about the others. Did you find it? I drew closer to Jimin and asked. Find what? Jimin sounded confused. Your house. Jimin nodded. I grew up in an orphanage right there. I pointed to a place beyond the railroad. Do you see the supermarket in the direction of the river from the gas station where Namjoon works? Do you see the clover-shaped neon sign behind it? The orphanage is to the left of the neon sign. I lived there for more than 10 years. Jimin's eyes seemed to wonder why I was telling him all this. My friends already knew that I grew up in that orphanage. I considered it my home. I didn't force myself to think that for peace of mind. I really believed that it was my home, a home without mom. I have something to confess. Something I'd been lying about. That my narcolepsy was fake. That might have been why I couldn't ask anything about anyone. It wasn't because I was afraid of hurting them, it was because I had lied. because I didn't have the courage to be honest, because once I admitted it, I'd also have to admit I have no one to call mom. Not just at the orphanage, but in the entire world. That must have been why I didn't ask any of them about their problems. Jimin wasn't good at hiding his feelings. His startled look was self-explanatory. I didn't know how to apologize to him. Jimin had agonized over me countless times. He must have burst into tears when he first witnessed it. I didn't do it on purpose. I just must have ignored that there was a way for me to be okay. I know this doesn't make sense. I can't describe it clearly. Then are you okay now? Jimin, who'd been listening quietly for some time, turned his head toward me and asked the question, am I okay now? I asked myself. Jimin was still looking at me. He was neither criticizing nor sympathizing with me. I looked down at the brightly lit city below. I don't know. We'll be able to figure it out as time goes by. I'm looking forward to it, aren't you? Jimin giggled and laughed along. Okay. The 19th of May. Jimin's entry. So 3 days later. Okay. I had to return to the Glass Flower Arboretum. I had to stop lying about not remembering what I had seen there. It was time to stop hiding in the hospital and put an end to my seizures. To do that, I had to go back there. But for days, I went to the shuttle bus stop and failed to get on the bus. After I watched the third bus of the day pull away, HYYH suddenly appeared and plunked down next to me. He said he came out because there was nothing to do and he was bored. Yeah, right, HYYH, come on. Then he asked me what I was doing here. I kept my head bent low and kicked the ground with the toe of my sneaker. I was sitting there because I didn't have courage. I wanted to pretend that I was okay now, that I knew enough, that I could easily overcome this, but I was afraid. I was afraid of not knowing what I was about to face, whether I would be able to endure it, or whether I would have a seizure again. HYYH looked relaxed. Laid back, he murmured something that sounded like, "The weather's so nice," in a carefree manner. The weather really was nice, but I was so tense that I couldn't afford to look around, let alone enjoy the weather. The sky was blue. A mild breeze blew occasionally. The shuttle bus was approaching from a distance. The bus stopped and the door opened. The driver stared at me. I asked HYYH, "Will you go with me?" Post-Sox entry, 20th of May, next day. I left the police station with Taehyung. Thank you. I bowed and I shouted all the more energetically, but I really wasn't in the mood. It wasn't far from the police station to Taehyung's house. If he lived farther from the police station, would he still be there as much? Why had his parents settled down so close to the police station? The world was so unjust and unfair to this foolishly good-hearted and sensitive kid. I placed my arm around Taehyung's shoulders and casually asked if he was hungry. Taehyung shook his head. "The police officers welcome you back and buy you a meal?" I asked again, but he didn't answer. The two of us walked in the sunlight, but an icy wind seemed to nip at my heart. I couldn't imagine how he must be feeling when I felt this chilly inside. His heart must have felt ripped and torn. Or does he have a heart left at all? How much anguish has he endured? I couldn't look him in his eyes, so I turned my glance upwards. An airplane was flying against the somewhat murky sky. I first saw the scar on Taehyung's back in Namjoon's container. I couldn't bring myself to ask about it when he was smiling so broadly with his new t-shirt present. I had no parents, I had no memory of dad, and my memory of mom stopped at the age of 7. I probably had more open wounds and scars regarding my family and childhood than anyone. People always said so easily that we need to overcome our wounds, embrace them, and accept them as part of our lives, that we need to reconcile with and forgive others to go on living. It wasn't that I wasn't aware of it, it wasn't that I didn't want to give it a try, but giving it a try didn't guarantee success. No one had taught me how. The world gave us new wounds, even before the old ones could heal. Surely, no one in the world can avoid getting hurt. I was aware of that, but do we really need to get hurt this deeply? For what? Why did these things happen to us? I'm okay. I can go home alone, Taehyung said at the intersection. I know. I led the way. I'm really okay. See, I'm fine, Taehyung smiled. I didn't respond. He couldn't be okay, but once he admitted that he wasn't okay, he wouldn't be able to bear it. So, he was just ignoring the truth. That became his habit. Taehyung followed me, putting up his hood. You're really not hungry? I asked him, when we had walked up to the outdoor hallway that led to his house. He smiled that foolish smile and nodded. I stayed for a little and watched him walk towards his door, and I finally turned around. The path he was walking down and the path I walked through were both narrow and bleak. He and I were both alone. Jin's entry on the 20th of May. Same day. Right? Yep, same day. Jin be acting creepy, dude, okay? Let's just be real. It's thundering, no rain. Okay, I'm gonna try to wrap this one up before it starts storming. Alright, let's see what creepy Jin's doing right now. Taehyung's house was in one of the oldest buildings in the neighborhood. Paint was peeling off here and there, and weeds were growing out of cracks in the cement walls. It looked run down. I was waiting for Taehyung and Hosuk in the small park on the hill behind the building, and it was on the slope. It overlooked the outdoor hallway on Taehyung's floor of the building. Hosuk appeared from around a corner leading into an alley in the distance. Taehyung was following him. His face wasn't quite visible because he had his hood pulled down tight. Taehyung and Hosuk exchanged a few words at the mouth of the alley. Taehyung seemed to be trying to send Hosuk home, and Hosuk was saying he was fine. Hosuk started to walk again first. The two came up to the front of the building without a word. Hosuk climbed the stairs and stopped in front of Taehyung's door. He tapped on Taehyung's shoulder and made a gesture at him to go into the house. Then he turned around and started walking toward the exit. Taehyung stared at him from behind for a moment and reached out for the doorknob. I called Hosuk at the moment when Taehyung began to open the door. After the dial tone rang 3 times, Hosuk took his phone out in the middle of the hallway. Taehyung was stepping into the house. Hosuk, can you call Taehyung? Hosuk stopped walking. I just saw him. I said I was planning a trip to the sea for all of us and he could ask Taehyung to come along. Hosuk laughed, saying of course Taehyung would come along. But just to make sure, could you ask him and let me know? I hung up hastily. This was the time. Hosuk must go to Taehyung's house. Hosuk tilted his head sideways, looking at his phone screen, turned around. Then, he went into Taehyung's house through the still open door. Is that the end? No, okay. Something's happening, man. I feel like Jin's plotting something. Okay. Same day, Taehyung. I looked down at my palm. Blood was oozing out. Just when my legs started to give out and I was about to collapse, someone grabbed me from behind. Sunlight came in through the murky window. My sister was crying, and Hosuk was standing there in silence. As usual, the floor was cluttered with dirty dishes, odds and ends, and blankets. Dad had already escaped the room before I realized it. The uncontrollable rage and sorrow that welled up when I flung myself at Dad were still fresh in my mind. I didn't know what held me back when I was about to stab him. I didn't know how to douse these raging flames inside me. I wanted to kill myself instead of Dad. If I could, I wanted to drop dead right then and there. I couldn't shed tears. I wanted to cry out loud, kick and destroy everything, and break down. But it all seemed beyond my control. Sorry, Hosuk, I'm fine. You go ahead. My voice sounded dry and calm. Contrary to my frantic mind, I sent Hosuk home against his will and looked down at my palm. Blood was still coming out in drops. Instead of stabbing Dad, I'd smashed a bottle on the floor. The bottle had broken into pieces and cut my palm. The world spun and twirled When I closed my eyes, my brain froze. What should I do now? How should I live? After I regained consciousness, I found myself looking at Namjoon's number. Even in this situation, or because of this situation, I was longing for Namjoon all the more desperately. I wanted to confess to him I almost killed Dad, who brought me into this world and who beat me every day. I almost killed him. No, I actually killed him. Countless times. I killed him countless times in my head. I want to kill him. I want to die. I don't know what to do. I'm lost. I just want to see you now. End chapter. Creepy. There's a lot going on. We got to see a heavy perspective of Jimin and J-Hope's interaction in the hospital, and their aspects, more or less figuring out what was going on with Jimin and finding out why he was in the mental hospital, because and why J-Hope was in the mental hospital as well. Also find out that J-Hope was faking narcolepsy the whole time. Just kind of interesting, you know? Just really interesting. Makes you wonder why he was faking it. Probably for attention. I'm not gonna make any straight theories just yet, but it's cool to watch the story unfold a little bit. Jin's little plot thing that he's doing, this is gonna have something to do with my theory at the end of this, because like I'm starting to see things. Comparing the videos to the notes, it's obvious why they brought the notes out, if this theory is correct. So we're gonna finish reading before I talk to you guys about it. I see you, Jin.